Okay, so at some point, I guess my slides will show. Okay, so welcome everybody. This is my talk, New Shell in Town, Adventures in Using PowerShell on Linux. I'm Fernando Tomlinson, and Gail, I certainly appreciate the introduction. A little bit more about myself. I'm recently retired from the U.S. Army, 10 days or so. The beard, something I'm trying out. I was a warrant officer in the, thank you. I was a warrant officer in the United States Army, 20 years. My first half of my career, if you will, were focused on system administration. The latter half, was focused cyber, very defensive, offensive focus. I'm a Purple Heart recipient. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, but I'm here, and I'm certainly happy about that. I'm also a cybersecurity adjunct professor where I teach a number of subjects, PowerShell, Python, Linux, also digital forensics. For me, that allows me to share kind of what I know, what I've seen, what I've experienced, and share that with other individuals who are looking to also progress or also have interaction with other people as well. I'm a developer of various blue and red team PowerShell tools. I think the language is certainly amazing given the task at hand, not necessarily one that you will use for every operation or instance. I'm also a co-author of the PowerShell Conference book, Volume 2. This book, I make no proceeds from it. The purpose of the book is to take the proceeds and give it to underrepresented, privileged individuals, allowing them to get their start in cybersecurity. I recall 20 years ago, I didn't really know computers, right? Things have changed, obviously, but I too got a start by way of somebody taking some time to help me, and I want to do the same thing for individuals, and that's where the proceeds go for that book. I developed a number of interactive PowerShell training platforms because I believe in the language. I want to make it easier for people to grasp the language and understand it, and I'll talk a little bit about those later on in the talk. And I'm on the interwebs in a number of places, but enough about me, right? You're here to really talk about Linux on PowerShell. As I was putting this together, there were a substantial amount of things that I wanted to shove in here. And that's no different than really any other topic I talk about, but I've lowered it to a number of things that we see on the screen there. So what is this PowerShell? Well, it came to light in 2006, birth as PowerShell, but it really was developed back in 2002 when it was originally named Monad. It's implemented really as a piece of Windows as we traditionally think about it, can be embedded from a GUI or console perspective. It goes beyond just the binaries that we know to be PowerShell.exe, PowerShell_ISC.exe in Windows, but really the DLL, which is compiled.NET, is the actual PowerShell itself. It's a scripting language. I like to definitely say object-oriented in nature. What makes it great is we're piping actual objects as opposed to raw text. So as I talk a little bit more about Linux, if you're a Linux person in here, you know to get particular data sets within an output, you might be sed, awking, cutting, or cut, awk, sed, right? Some variation of it, trying to get particularly what you want. But in PowerShell, we can convert those things to objects. We can get exactly what we want when we need it in a very timely fashion. Now, the thing that also makes PowerShell great is it's built on top of .NET. It is .NET at its core, so that gives us access to a range of .NET classes. It also allows us to get data in a way that we traditionally wouldn't have been able to do it. Specifically from a Windows perspective, we have Windows APIs that make those things available to us. Now, from a blue team perspective, well, generally, there are some great advantages. If this was very specific to Windows, the top bullet would say it's already resident Windows 7 in Server 2008, right? But since we're talking about Linux here, some of the things are still the same. We have access to the APIs, specifically when we are remoting from Linux to Windows, right, which is what we'll do through one of the demos. We have the ability to track its use, the abuse of it within our system. Now, granted, we need to do some configuration changes to enable that. However, we have the ability to gain that visibility. We have the ability to make endpoint detection response capabilities, and we can encrypt that so that way if somebody is already on our network, we're not just sending that stuff over the wire in plain text. And for you who may be in an organization where you can't afford the next-gen EDR or or may not be allowed to put an open source platform on your network, you can build detection scripts and things to kind of get after your task in lieu of having those things. Now, the things that make it great from a blue team perspective, well, one could argue also makes it great from a red team perspective. I enjoy going to a friend's house, and when I inquire about what I should bring, maybe an adult beverage, they say, Nando, don't worry about it. We just want you to show up. Well, from a red team perspective, with PowerShell enabled, that is kind of the same concept, that one may be able to get through their red team objectives by utilizing what's already there. And because admins may not be too accustomed with PowerShell, there is a chance they might be using an older version, depending on what version of Windows they're using, or if they're using a new version, they may not have it configured right to be able to illuminate things that are being abused from a red team perspective. It also is noted that, hey, from a blue team side, encrypting the traffic is great. That is equally as important from a red team perspective, and depending on how we're using it, we can execute it in such a way where it doesn't touch disk, reducing our abilities to be found. And it's script-based, so when we look at detection mechanisms, well, we can continuously do a cat and mouse game in that aspect and quickly shift and bypass those mechanisms. Now, if that isn't enough, I looked at something like CISA, right? So based upon 2020's recording, CISA noted that from an execution standpoint for incidents or evaluations that they responded to, PowerShell continues to lead the pack. From an execution standpoint, 24% of those indications were based upon PowerShell. Last year, the year before that, 2019, it was something like 40-something%. So it's decreased. However, it continues to lead the pack. This is not going anywhere. If we look at the use of the language as a whole, well, there's tactics that are red specific, but some of them overlap in the blue side or a system administrator perspective. And the same could be said for sysadmins and defensive folks in nature. Now, if that's not enough, I like to present, maybe something that I call objective in nature, and that's going to be Red Monk's take on the use of the language. Based upon the number of pull requests and commits in GitHub and the tags associated in Stack Overflow, we're able to see I don't want to call it a popularity, but popularity for lack of better words, of where PowerShell stacks up. Now, I recognize it's not at the very top. Okay with that as a PowerSheller, right? Because I see things that should certainly be there, specifically C, definitely some Python, and a number of other things, but it's not at the bottom, right? And for somebody who is dealing with this language that is so versatile, that speaks volumes. Now, if that's not enough, because as we talk about red and blue and maybe some sysadmin aspect of it, well, there's a gentleman who developed a module to control his Tesla, right? And bless him, I really wanted to test this for myself. However, my wife would not allow me to get a Tesla, and I don't have one. I tried to go to the dealership, and they weren't too keen on me testing it either, so I'll just have to take the man's saying, for what it is. Now, you may be thinking, well, is this a joke, right? Red team, blue team, sysadmin, what CISA's saying, controlling it with Tesla, controlling your Tesla rather, Red Monk, all these things. Well, no, I'm very serious. And as I continue here, it may seem like I work for Microsoft, and I don't, right? I am certainly a fan of the language because firsthand from a blue team perspective, I've seen the power within it. Firsthand from a red team perspective, I've seen the power in it. So I just want to really set this disclaimer, right? And you see it before you can read it. Now, you may be saying TLDR, too long didn't read, or you might be saying too small couldn't read. So let me sum this up for you. I'm not saying PowerShell is the best language for every situation. I am merely highlighting how powerful it is as a cross-platform language. Your environment, the task at hand, will really depict if this is the best approach for you. All right, so with that, there's a number of versions. You might have heard of Windows PowerShell, PowerShell Core and all this other type stuff. What is all of this? Well, Windows PowerShell is specific to Windows, and Microsoft isn't developing on that anymore. The last version is Windows PowerShell 5.1. And as you look at the chart, you can see what version of PowerShell becomes resonant with each version of operating system. Now, just because Windows 7 comes with PowerShell version 2 doesn't mean it can't be upgraded to version 5. If you still have Windows 7, in your network, you should absolutely do so. Windows PowerShell 2 doesn't have good security features, right? Now, I say that because as we move on, Microsoft has put all their eggs in PowerShell Core, the cross-platform version. This cross-platform version, well, it's PowerShell for everyone. If you're using Windows, you can absolutely use Core. If you're using Linux, different variations and distros of it, you can use it there. And if you're a Mac person, you can use it there as well. There's other platforms that also support it. So if you're using Docker and containers, or maybe you're going to pull down the latest Kali repo, that type stuff is already in there for us as well. We can have Windows PowerShell 2 through 5 installed on the same system from a Windows perspective that we have PowerShell Core 6 and or 7. So this is great. So they could be installed side by side. Going deeper with this PowerShell Core, it was announced in 2016, hey, we're going to open source this thing. We're going to make PowerShell for everyone or everything, right? 2018, that's when it hit the streets. And in some respect, people were racing to it. I know my organization, we certainly were taking advantage of the previews and getting it on our systems. Now, at the end of the day, this is still built on .NET. It is not a full subset of .NET. It is a .NET Core, a reduced aspect of it. But we still have access to some classes within .NET that are built within that core functionality. So that still makes it a plus. Again, Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and when we're launching this on one of those systems, regardless of the platform, PowerShell Core, it's actually pwsh.exe. It's going to be installed from a Windows perspective in program files. From a Nix perspective, it's going to be in your /opt folder. All right, so when you go out to their GitHub, because it's, again, open source, you'll be presented with something like this, and you can see the chart, and you have a couple of options for downloading it and installing it. You can have an LTS version, the stable, whatever the preview is, and then they specify how do you install it for each. If this is not necessarily your flavor, well, you got a couple of options for how you can install it. Simply, you can browse out to GitHub, manually download it, and manually install it. Okay, right? If you're in cyber, you may be a little lazy when it comes to the keyboard. I'm guilty of that, right? If I have to do something more than one time, or if I can automate it, I certainly want to do that. So I then look at option 2, where somebody's made a script where we can actually download it, and then it will reach out, download the binary, and then do the installation for us, right? So use the script, it downloads PowerShell, and then we can install it. That's a manual thing. Or there's another one-liner that not only downloads PowerShell, it also installs it, but then we have the ability to install VS Code and a number of other things with it, right? So if you're using PowerShell Core, you're going to need an editor. You might be one of these hardcore folks where it's like, no, VI or Vim till I die. Okay, right? That's still an option for you. But you might want to use VS Code. We can do that as well. Now, walking through this, because I want to show how easy it is, right? Because you may not be using PowerShell because of the misunderstanding that it might be difficult to get started with. No, it's very simple. So I'm going to go through with option 2. I utilize a simple wget to pull it down. I just installed it to my local system because I want to walk through it. You could have used the other one-liner to do it all for you. And then once I have it downloaded, I'm going to run my install PowerShell.sh, right? I would have chmoded and changed the permissions to make it executable, but you got that. Now, within that script, as I look at it, I see a number of switches. Those switches enable me to install VS Code, also install the PowerShell extension as well. That's going to help my user experience when I'm within that IDE. Now, once I'm there, right, I've already looked at the script, seen those switches. Now I'm just going to execute the script. I'm saying install the IDE with it. It's going to go through all the checks associated with it, install, and actually, download and actually install it for me. Now, as I talk about VS Code, because it kind of goes hand in hand, any editor would suffice, right? So when you're traditionally on a Linux box, if you're not using VS Code, you might be using VI, you might be using Vim, right? Some of us might be using gedit or mousepad. Look, this is not a place in which I'm judging you. However, what I am saying is an editor is an editor, and whatever works for you works. If you're using VS Code, the PowerShell extension, well, you get some things that you might be used to from a Windows PowerShell perspective when you're using the ISE. IntelliSense, right? Brace matching, all the great things that we don't necessarily want to have to think about when we're actually developing. We just want to work in a seamless environment. Now, when we look at executing commands within PowerShell, I mentioned PWSH is the binary within Linux for us to, is PowerShell within Linux. So we can execute PWSH and drop down into an interactive session within PowerShell, right? Or we can just call upon said binary and then give it a switch of command and execute a command. Whichever one works best for you. I'm a big Reese's fan, right? There's a number of ways to eat that thing. It all makes it to the end, the destination, right, if you will. Now, being a huge PowerShell fan, when I moved over to Linux and Mac with it, I was like, this is great. I'm going to do all these great things that I already know how to do in Windows. Maybe I'll die down some of my Python and just kind of focus here. Here's a couple of gotchas for now. And they may not be gotchas in the long term. One of them is, guess what? PowerShell, specifically when you think about Windows, but PowerShell as well, is not case sensitive. But Linux is still case sensitive, right? So it's not case sensitive until it is. Specifically, as an example, when we're trying to browse part of the directory structure, right? Desktop downloads, that's going to be uppercase. So we need to be cognizant of that. If we would have started on the Windows side specifically with it, we would have certainly gotten used to just typing it as is. PowerShell from a Windows perspective in our alias drive had a number of aliases that made it easy for us to get started with the language. For example, you jumped on PowerShell on Windows and you're like, I came from Linux. I want to be able to read a file. Well, you just type in cat. That alias of cat was really tied back to get content in Windows. So while that got you started using PowerShell in Windows, you now move over to Linux, and those aliases may not be there because they're actual commands in Linux. ls is one, for example. ps in Windows PowerShell will give you a process list. ps in Linux still gives you a process list, but not in the same fashion in which get process would do it. All right, so we have to be cognizant of that as well. There are substantially less commandlets in PowerShell core, specifically on my example here, because I use CentOS, than what there is in Windows PowerShell. At the moment, my CentOS shows 274 commandlets. PowerShell Core 7 on a Windows machine shows 5,040, and my Windows PowerShell 5.1 shows roughly 5,200. All right? Some of them you may not even be missing. Some of them you will absolutely recognize they are gone. Right? So now that Microsoft has moved away from developing specifically on Windows PowerShell for the Windows operating system and now are opening their aperture, right, it's going to take a little bit of time for those things to catch up. We also have to be cognizant that the Windows operating system is significantly different than some of these other operating systems, so some of them may not ever be there. A great feature is PowerShell remoting. Right? When we think Windows to Windows PowerShell remoting, right, awesome. We have PowerShell remoting with Linux PowerShell core, but it's executing over SSH. Not a bad thing, just something for us to be cognizant of. And we'll walk through actually doing that and executing commands here in a minute. The bad thing about that is, well, not the bad thing, the thing that we just need to be aware of is we don't have WSMan support, which then leads us to not be able to execute the simple command we may be used to from Windows, enable PSRemoting. Yeah, that doesn't exist. So we now have to be in such a place where we need to not only enable PowerShell remoting, but we need to configure it. So since it's using SSH, we now need to have an SSH server and client. And then we need to go into the SSH config, and we need to allow it, but then we have to specify that as connections come in that are for PowerShell, they need to be sent down to the subsystem, which is then PowerShell. So it's almost like a broker, if you will. But it seamlessly works once configured right. If you're like me, well, you might like Windows Management Instrumentation or SIMS, Common Information Model, right? But in Linux, we don't have that right now. There is a project to get after a long-term solution being open management infrastructure, which is going to give us that management information that we are used to, maybe from an admin perspective, or one that you are able to leverage from a defense perspective, or one that you're able to certainly take advantage of and abuse from an offense perspective. But right now, we don't have that. So that's that kind of hurt a little bit, but something to be aware of. Commands can be blended. So I can take my PowerShell pure commandlets and I can pipe them to resident commands within Linux. So I can blend those together, right? Now, you may want to be cognizant of kind of what you're trying to get after and output, but nonetheless, we can absolutely do that. The help documentation, I'm typically one, right? When I start to talk to you about PowerShell, I want to show you the help and show you how to use it, right? So beyond our conversation, you can kind of fish and support yourself. The help documentation from a PowerShell core perspective is a work in progress. As we recognize there's substantially less commandlets in PowerShell core, a lot of the commandlets still kind of speak towards how do you do it from a Windows perspective. So it's a work in progress, right? But nonetheless, the help is generally good. I found great use of out grid view in Windows PowerShell, right? The visual Excel-like pop-out that allowed me to do some parsing and analysis in a tactical perspective, I loved it, right? That doesn't exist in PowerShell core. So again, something to be cognizant of. We recognize that when we look at hard drives, well, these hard drives in a physical standpoint have sectors on them. And we are able to load an operating system on there that then makes those sectors available to us within our operating system, i.e. the file system, C drive, D drive, E drive, whatever. Well, PowerShell has these drives that seek to do essentially the same thing in some respect. So from a Windows perspective, we have not only the file system map, we have a drive for aliases, variables, functions, certificates, right? If you're hunting expired self-signed certificates or what have you. It also maps the registry, so we can browse the registry almost like we're browsing a file system, and that's great. Now, you may recognize that some of these things don't exist in Linux, and you're correct. And where it doesn't exist in Linux, well, those types of drives don't exist. And looking at it, we see a keen difference between the two. But nonetheless, we still have our drives. We still have the ability to map said drives. We just don't have the things that are common to Windows in our Linux machine, and that makes sense. One of the greatest things Microsoft did in terms of PowerShell was create login features, right? So script block module, transaction, or transcription rather. Well, those type things still exist from a PowerShell core. They're not on by default. We need to create a config file that actually enables it. So this is going to be an opt Microsoft PowerShell 7 or whatever your version is. The config file is going to sit there, and there's a template that you can download off of Microsoft's sites, or you can just kind of make your own and deploy it. When it logs, and it's very verbose, much like the Windows PowerShell aspect of it, depending on the distro and the flavor, it's going to log in a couple of places. So from a Red Hat perspective, you see it's going to go to messages or secure. From a Debian perspective, syslog or offlog. Now, when I go in there and I start looking at that, I have all kinds of stuff that are mixed in. And I want to be able to separate the specific PowerShell core stuff versus some of the other stuff. So I'll put a link up here to my GitHub where I've gone through and made a script, the parser, to be able to do that so you can see just the PowerShell specific stuff. But it's simple for us to create and enable this login. And really what we need to be cognizant of is once we have that config file, we then just need to restart our PowerShell instance and we are good to go. Parsing logs, wow, right? Everything is just raw text, if you will, from a text file perspective in Linux. And cool, grep is your best friend if you're just a Linux person. But I want objects, right? I want to be able to grab specific properties. I want to be able to utilize methods associated with said objects. And guess what? PowerShell enables us to be object focused in nature. Either the commandlets are going to enable that, or we can turn this flat text into objects ourselves. And where we have to do that once, right, we work hard up front to be able to reuse it many times. We can now share that parser to be able to actually do that. So, I mean, what are the big things? We want to be able to manage this data. We want to be able to manipulate it and store it. The quicker and more easily accessible this type of data is, the more effective we are at problem solving, right? Let's think about this. If I'm red team focused, I want to inundate you with data. I want to bypass your ability to manually process this data. From a blue team perspective, I recognize that I need to make this data, I need to put this data rather in such a format that I can easily understand, digest, and act upon. And this is where the objects come into play. So as I look at the screenshot here, you have where I'm looking at var log secure, and then I've already used a parser that I created that's on my GitHub. I'll get to that at the end, where I'm now able to just look at that log file as an object. So I have a property called time, I got a property called process, ID, message, and I can get to what I want. If I want just the process field, well, I can select and return just that process property, right? That is a game changer for us. As we look at even just the processes, PSOX, well, we recognize what that's going to give us. That's generally what we're going to use when we're on a Linux machine. And when we execute get process from PowerShell, well, it has its default presentation of what properties it shows us. But if we wanted to replicate what PSOX is showing us versus what get process is, well, we just do what I have before us. Where we call upon get process, we select those properties that we want to see, and they present themselves. This isn't here where I'm like, well, I got to cut that, and let me count this and set and awk, and let me change it again. No. I select the property I want to see. That property is returned, right? And I'm able to continuously shape that. And I don't have to think about switches. Is it O? Is it A? Is it big A? What's the property name? All right. Now, leading or following on with that, we've already mentioned kind of how objects are great. And I just want to highlight something as simple as retrieving all PIDs. From a Linux perspective, well, we have a number of switches and methods for us to do it. We could almost take a half a day and go through where everybody comes up with their own way to pull just a PID. Nobody has time for that. Not when I'm chasing an adversary and time is of the essence. So if I'm in PowerShell and I just want the PID, I select the ID and I'm done with it. And I can rinse and repeat that every time. Mentally, that's something easy that I can digest, understand, and act upon, as opposed to me, big A, big O, little o. Let me look at the man pages. Right? From a defensive, maybe offensive perspective, generally everybody is going to want to do some form of a survey. What's in your survey from a day-to-day perspective may be different than what I'm highlighting here. A survey is a survey. I want to get a better understanding of the system so I can then make a decision of what I'm going to do next. And a lot of those things are pretty common in nature. Because they're common in nature, if you're already using PowerShell on Windows, you'll be able to utilize those same commands in this fashion to get that data. It's not, how do I get the process list in Windows, and now how do I get the process list in Linux? I use the same command in both to get that data. A couple things I do want to highlight on are services, install packages, and cron jobs, because at present, PowerShell core in Linux doesn't have a commandlet to do that. So I recognize that's a key task, develop some code, put it out there on my GitHub, because I want to share it with the community. And why are we looking at services? Well, we want to understand processes that are being run. We want to understand when they're being used, what they're actually doing for us. And let's be honest, malware is going to execute one of two places, on disk and memory. If it's on disk, it's going to execute, and we want to be able to actually eliminate and see that. Now, again, PowerShell doesn't have a built-in method for us to do this, PowerShell core. And as I look at the screenshot, the top one, top right, is just me looking at system control, because I'm in CentOS, and that data just coming to the screen. Blah. I could grep my way through, right, or do some sed, awk, cut, awk, sed, whatever, to get specifically what I need, but instead, create a script, and now I get that thing back as an object, and it's in a usable format that an analyst can understand and actually act upon. Same thing with packages. Right? I've already changed this to an object, and now that I have that object, I can specifically filter for what I want. I can look for where, it's just all packages, giving me all the package names. I can look for where the package itself starts with power. Right? This is rinse and reuse repeatable. It doesn't matter if I'm on Linux, Mac, or Windows. that is still the same once I have it as an object. Cron Jobs, one of the bigger ones, right? So when we think of cron jobs in Linux, the closest thing we might have had to that in Windows is scheduled tasks. I want to be able to see this. I want to be able to understand it, digest it, act upon, because an adversary is going to look for some form of persistence, right? This is pretty simple in nature. But when you look at your cron jobs, right, unless you're looking at them on an everyday basis, you're like, okay, let me see, the third one I think is hour, maybe that's day of the week. What does that one mean again, right? So you create this parser that not only transforms it to an object, but puts it in a usable format for you, the analyst, so you can save time each time and get after your task and objectives. So suspending processes. This was key. I started doing this on a Windows perspective, right? Responding to an incident, something malicious is happening, and it's almost like responding to a bomb, if you will. Well, let's defuse it. Well, hold on. We got to understand what we're doing here, but the time is ticking. So if I'm able to suspend that process to essentially pause the time from ticking, now we can kind of have a conversation about the best way forward without having a next stage kickoff or whatever is actually happening. Bringing that over to a Linux perspective, well, I can use almost the same code. A little bit different from a Windows PowerShell perspective, but the mindset is still the same. So we can suspend and resume said process when and how we want to. This allows us to actually retrieve, I don't know, ransomware keys, may stop ransomware from actually continuously encrypting a drive if we can catch it at the earlier stages. And depending on what that binary is, we can stop the breaking of critical processes. Right? So let's walk through this and show an example. All right, so from this perspective, I'm going to go in and I'm in the Linux box. I have my VS Code here, and then I have another window off to the side. I don't need that. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to get the PID, the process ID associated with my PowerShell process on the right. That is the one that I'm going to execute a little script that simply just loops through. It doesn't do anything other than that. All right, so it's looping through. My PID is 56629. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to execute my code. It takes one parameter, and that parameter is ID. I'll feed it 56629, and we see that on the right hand it's still going, and I'll execute it. I pause that process. It is now in a wait state. It's not taking any more instructions. So now my team and I, we can think through logically what we're going to do, as opposed to in a hasty position, just do something that may cause the situation to be worse, right? Like I don't want to be here all day kind of dealing with this, so let's think through this logically. And then once we get to a point where we can then move on, we'll resume it. Or you may be working with malware in a range where it executes, it then pops itself into another process and then dies off. But it happens so quick. So you can get to a point where you can actually pause that and then you can actually dump that sample. But now that we've kind of talked through it, I'm going to go ahead and resume it. And I just have another function, resume process, that does the inverse, same thing, one parameter, and we're going to feed it our PID. And when we're done, it resumes. So no harm, no foul. Will it work for what you're trying to do in your organization? Maybe situational dependent. However, there's been huge benefit in my organization and the jobs or assignments that I've been on where it has. Okay, so you might have been on Linux before and just used the simple HTTP server in Python. Does exactly what you needed to do, how you needed to do it, when you needed to do it, right? So very hasty in nature, stand up a server. Maybe you want to go get a second stage of your payload. Maybe you're an sysadmin, defensive person, and you just want to go grab something to get it to another machine. Either way, we can set this server up. It's fully customizable in nature. If it's a well-known port, we need admin rights. If it's not a well-known port, then guess what? We can do this as a standard user. By default, I have it set to where it serves up content on the desktop, but you can fully customize that as well, however you need it, when you need it. So let's walk through it as well. Okay, in this perspective, I'm calling upon the PowerShell program, and I'm going to execute my code. It's bound to 9046. So I'm now just going to come back over to a PowerShell instance I have on Windows, and I'm going to utilize invoke web request. Very simple. Use bitch transfer or any other unique way to reach out and grab that information. I'm hosting it on 9046. So when I execute that just on 9046, I get that text data back about it. Now, I could get the text data associated with whatever I have on my desktop on that server. In this case, I have a script that's just test ps1. It doesn't necessarily have to be a script. It could be whatever you want it to be. The same thing, I'm going to get that text data back. If I want to actually store or save a copy to that, well, I can utilize the out file switch, or parameter rather, and then specify a path. I'm going to save this to my local directory in which I'm executing this, which is woof, and I'm going to save it as bsides.txt instead of actual PowerShell. Now, when I do that, well, you guessed it, I get a copy on my local machine, and when I'm done, I just go ahead and tear down that other server. But it's very simple, it's very quick, and it's something like 50 lines of code. Probably could make it a lot less than that if we weren't worried about formatting and trying to make it pretty. But certainly seeing the versatility associated with the language we feel already comfortable with from a Windows perspective, but being able to do it on Linux. If that wasn't enough, web shells, as you can imagine, and as you know, are certainly a big deal. Specifically when I'm hosting content or I have a server that is hosting content. When I look at traffic headed to that server on well-known ports, if you will, don't necessarily cause concern. They certainly don't necessarily stand out. But these web shells can serve as a method of persistence for an actor to be on our system. Well, typically, we're thinking PHP, ASP, .NET, what have you, but let's do this in PowerShell, all right, where we can have this PowerShell script serve this content up for us, customize it the way that we want and how we need it. Now, the one I'm going to display here, it's very simple in nature. You'll navigate out to the path. We'll feed it a subset of the URI and then specify a command that we want. But you can have full-fledged GUI applications just off of this, kind of blending in with whatever else is being served there. And for us to do that, well, it's not as intuitive as it may sound. It, too, is a relatively short amount of code, and we're talking maybe 40 lines of code. So I'm going to come in, and we're going to execute said code. Here I'm binding or opening a port 9035. The same thing, though, right? I need to make sure I have applicable rights, or I can bundle it in such a way where it's being served through the same path of that application. This is clear text at the moment. However, you can certainly attach your own certificate to it, be it self-signed, Let's Encrypt, or one that you buy yourself. Now, once I have this, I'll then come out and we'll navigate to it. So at the index of that web server, all it does is return a string. But let's say I wanted to actually execute commands. Well, I have in there, you can specify a command. I might say, who am I? And then it's going to return that information for me. Let's say I want to execute something else, maybe get a process list. Well, we'll get that information back as well. All right, we're talking 30, 40 lines. Again, could probably compress it a lot more. The smaller the footprint, the better, as you could imagine. But cross-platform. Doesn't matter what box I'm really landing on. Maybe a couple of lines differ if it's Linux versus Windows, but I'm not having to make a full-fledged web shell for this operating system and then make a full-fledged one for that. Instead, I'm just really writing it once, using it many times. So PSRemoting, right? Again, I had mentioned earlier, this is happening over SSH, right? We're going to require PowerShell core or higher, right? We need SSH client and server on both of the systems that are going to be taking place in this. And this is essentially creating a PowerShell host on the target machine as an SSH subsystem, which is why when we configure SSH within the config, we are saying, hey, anything bound for PowerShell, go ahead and send it to the subsystem of PowerShell. Traditionally, PowerShell remoting has been Windows to Windows. Traditionally, it has been 5985 plain text HTTP or 5986 for HTTPS because we were able to use WinRM, right, to do this on behalf of us, but we don't have that here. If we look at how it actually operates, well, it's something like this. We have the PowerShell client on both systems. Both systems, as the client is trying to connect to said server, if you will, PowerShell is sending that information to that SSH client. In this case, we're using OpenSSH. That OpenSSH client is then doing a configuration or settings negotiation with that SSH server. That SSH server is then passing it through the subsystem down to PowerShell core and vice versa on that. Now, if you're not too keen over OpenSSH or just using SSH as a whole, well, if you're doing red team activities, you might be familiar with SOCAT. Well, you could use SOCAT as well. One thing that I have not been able to get to work is other variations. But now we have endless possibilities for us to do it as opposed to SSH into a Windows machine and then just calling upon PowerShell and leveraging it. No, we can utilize some of these things that are already configured to transform, translate, and send data on our behalf. So let's look at how do we just utilize this at the most simplest level. Okay, so I'm going to come back in here. I'll go to my Windows machine, and I'm going to, my Linux machine. I'm going to connect to my Windows machine. And I'm going to do this the same way I would do if I was using a traditional PowerShell remoting tactic. I'm going to enter PS session. And when I do so, I'm going to specify the IP or host name, and I'm going to specify my username. I'll put in my username, and I'll get connected. I can tell I'm connected to said machine because my path has changed. If I would have used the host name, the path would include the host name. I used the IP, so it now includes this. And from here, well, I can execute things that we would execute, period, in a PowerShell instance, all right? So I can see my username is Wolf. I can get processes. I can continue to do whatever it is that I want to do. Since I've PSRemoted from Linux to Windows, I can now take advantage of those 5,000 commandlets that are available on that system, as opposed to the 200 and so that were available on my local machine. It's really that simple once we have it set up. Once I'm done, I can exit PS session and be good to go. Now, let's look at it from an opposite perspective. The opposite perspective of I'm on a Windows box and I want to connect to a Linux machine. Well, I'd come in here and I'm going to enter PS session, same way. I'll specify my host name, and then I'm going to specify my IP. My IP in this aspect is .6. I also have my username. My username is going to be Nando. Actually, I have the wrong IP. I said a prayer to the demo gods earlier, and it seemed like they accepted it. I did not. And this is why you should record said talks. Oh, well, you know what? The demo guys just whispered in my ear mic here. It would help if I had the right IP. Right? Demo guys are like, yo, you said you were doing critical stuff today, like a ransomware operator. We said we were going to leave you alone. Our bad. We didn't mean to mess you up. But we'll help you. You got the wrong IP. All right, so cool. So again, my path is now changed. I'm in my Linux machine, and the same thing, right? If I wanted to go in here and figure out who I am, well, I can do that, and I recognize I'm Nando. But again, when we look at our commands, because I'm in Linux, and Linux cares about case sensitivity, notice how when I call upon that environment variable of user, lowercase, I get nada, nothing. Because Linux is looking for that uppercase aspect. So we have to reshape some of the things that we're accustomed to because of that. But when I'm in here, I'm good to go. Now this is me doing it from a one machine perspective. We can also invoke command and actually do this across a subset of systems. So we'll come in here, and I'm going to create this session, and I'm going to store it in a variable called session. Once I have that, I can then, actually I'll go back and look at session. Yes, I could. You could absolutely do that. Now, once I've created that session, I'll go back in and I'll see it's open. Once I have that, based upon individual IP or a subnet, I can certainly invoke command, call upon session, feed it a script block, and when I do so, well, this is then going to have this script block, script, whatever I feed it, actually execute and come back to me in a serial manner. Right now I'm only doing it on one machine, but if I was doing it on multiple machines, there would be a property that would be added for the computer name, so I'd be able to tell what's what. If I don't want it to return the standard out, well, guess what? You can certainly outfile it and save it to your local machine. All right, so we're good to go in that aspect. And when I'm completely done with it, I'd be able to remove my session, because I don't want it to sit here. And when I look at session now, see that it's actually closed. So PowerShell remoting, again, isn't something that we're just going to use from a Windows to Windows perspective. We now have that ability, Linux to Windows, Windows to Linux. Holy crap. That's now a game changer, especially when I'm doing defense. I can wrap all of these things in one instantiation of what I'm trying to grab. I can go vice versa with it. I don't have to have my Linux only type tool set or my Windows only type tool set. I can absolutely write once, use many. That brings us to the benefits of cross-platforms, right? Now, this picture, I couldn't get my wife to take one of me, but that guy represents me, right? Newly retired, I've been wearing a uniform for 20 years, and now I need clothes. Well, I'm not gonna go out and buy clothes for every occasion. I need to be able to buy the least amount of clothes that work for everything, right? So I got my business attire. I got Nando at happy hour attire, right? All in one. That brings us to the benefits of cross-platform, right? Maximum effectiveness. The time as a developer, as an operator, right? It's of the essence. So how do I make the biggest benefit, the hugest benefit of the time that I have? How do I reuse this code? Maybe a good thing, could be a bad thing, but certainly worthwhile of exploring. Uniformity of design, swifter development, and certainly stability, right? Being able to wrap that in all into one. But this isn't new, right? There's been malware that was cross-platform in nature, predominantly Go, as you could imagine, right? But malware frameworks, Trojans, crypto miners, remote access, all that stuff. This isn't new. But as we continuously grab hold of this, specifically market share being Windows, Windows PowerShell, and then now being able to attack from a different perspective and take what we use on a market share aspect and leverage it on other networks that we may be concerned with, as opposed to coming from a different angle. Now, as I wrap this up here, again, I'm not saying this is the language. Go out and install it on your Mac or your Linux today. I am certainly telling you that if you're using Windows already and leveraging PowerShell, it is worthwhile for you from a time perspective to leverage it in a Linux or Mac environment because of the cross-platformness, but also be patient with them. It is a work in progress. PowerShell is certainly a powerful language. Many of you already know that. Again, work in progress. The environment would depict, if you use PowerShell, how you use it, and will it be beneficial for you, right? This isn't a one-size-fits-all, but certainly beneficial. And there's something to be said about any language that is object-oriented in nature, right? I can't leave without actually saying that. So if you're now at a point where you're like, okay, I am digging this PowerShell thing, and I am going to go install it on my Linux, Mac, whatever, well, you may feel like Thanos, right? Like, you now have Windows, you got a little Linux, you got Mac, you got Docker, and you got all the stones, right? Okay, I'm digging that, and let's certainly connect. But guess what? If you're not quite there yet, maybe you want to learn more about the language, but you just need a little bit of time, I got something for you as well, right? There's always more. Where am I at? Okay. So a friend of mine, Pete DeGiorgio, you see him out here with Security Onion doing the lockpick stuff. Him and another guy, Alex Sturkis, and I came up with this thing called Under the Wire. You might have heard of Over the Wire. It's a play on words for us. But PowerShell Focus, we drop you in a PowerShell console on our servers, and then we present you with a subset of challenges. As you answer one question and get the answer, that answer becomes the password for another user or another level. It focuses on the core aspects of the language because we want to give you a challenge to then want to go out there and learn and actually complete it. There's 75 challenges. They're all linear in nature, one after the other. To date, we've had roughly 197,000 plus unique connections from 78 different countries. It's free. We make nothing for it. If you got issues and you're on our Slack, I'm Wired Post, you get me, not some intern or somebody else. Like, I am passionate about the language, and I'm here to certainly have the conversations. If you're beyond that, then I have Posh Hunter for you. 90 challenges, non-linear, focused on offensive and defensive challenges. I give you a virtual machine with all kinds of stuff happening in it, and you're going to utilize the PowerShell language to answer them and then supply that to our scoring server. Now, you may be feeling like, oh, well, you're going to give me a virtual machine. I'm going to use the raw binaries on Windows. I'm using the GUI. Nah. I've already stripped all those things out. So when you boot up, you get a PowerShell console, and you get PowerShell ISC. I want to help you achieve your goals. These are all based upon realistic, first-hand, offensive challenges, defensive challenges, and you can solve them all in PowerShell. So with that brings me to the end. If there's any questions, this presentation, if you're interested, will be on my website. Any code that I've talked about here will also be on my GitHub with some other stuff. And there's my real presence on the interwebs, on Twitter. If I speak the language that you speak, or you just want to have a conversation, I'm open, right? You literally are going to get me. You're not going to get anybody else. I would love to have that conversation. If you're interested in gardening tools, that's not my thing, right? I can point you to somebody else, but if you want to talk anything IT side related, that is all me. So I'll pause here for any questions, and then I have questions. Sir, I'll come to you in a minute, young beard man. Sir. There is. So we take the team that was only working on PowerShell for Windows, and now they're working on everything, right? It's just taking a little bit of time. Yes. I'll come to you, A-Rod. Oh, sorry, Aaron.
So if you're developing these scripts to run on Windows and Linux, how do you handle path separation?
How do you handle what?
How do you handle your path separation?
Well, so
Windows backslash
So good question. The question was, how do you handle path separators, delimiters in Windows versus Linux? So the good thing is, when I do it in Windows, doesn't matter if it's forward or backwards, PowerShell and Windows will make sense of it. If that wasn't a concern for me, then I would do some analysis right up front. If this, then do that. If else that, then do that. So you still have to do some logic, right? It isn't just blah, right? You're going to have to add a couple more lines, but with that small separation, you'll be good to go. Hey, Rod. Yeah, so this, it actually works for both. Yeah. So I did a simple way where I was just doing by straight username, password, not worrying about domain, workstation, what have you. But there's a number of other options where you can specify as well for that actual environment. But in testing, it worked well. Okay, so who is the youngest person we have here? Do we have anybody under the age of 15? 16. We got 16? We have 15-year-old. Who's 15? Come on up, sir, ma'am. All right. So I once was 15. I'm only 2 years from 15, right? And all we need is a start. All we need is somebody to spark our interest and get us going. And you, sir, I hope this does it for you, right? All right, sit on. All right, so we had two people that were 16, right? 16. 16? All right. What year was PowerShell named PowerShell? What year did PowerShell get released for Linux? Not 2008. PowerShell was released for Linux somewhere between 2015 and 2020. Okay, well, you were the closest. Here you go. It was 2018. You, ma'am, I hope this book serves you well, and I hope you find a love for PowerShell, and when you have that love, pass it on to somebody else, okay? All right, with that, again, I appreciate your time. I'll be hanging out somewhere around here. Let's chat. Thank you.